From ELCA Advocacy, this is Here I Pod. There's so much happening in our communities every week and every day that are impacted by policies at the local, state, and federal levels. Here I Pod will focus on one aspect of what's happening each episode by talking with faith-based advocates, as well as providing steps that you can take in your own advocacy efforts. In this episode, we're exploring themes around disaster preparedness and response, and how recent changes to FEMA and AmeriCorps are affecting events on the ground already. As you'll hear, these issues weave through the federal, state, and local levels that we seek to cover on this program. We start with a conversation between host Regina Banks and Christine Moffett around federal policy changes. Following their talk, Regina speaks to Maren Olson from Lutheran Disaster Response, often referred to as LDR. We'll then hear stories about Lutheran Disaster Response's local impact from Jamie Benneker, Disaster Response Coordinator for the ELCA's Indiana-Kentucky Synod. This episode will close with reflections from Christine and Mary about where they have seen the gospel at work, and how you can get involved in disaster preparedness for your community, as well as how you can support LDR. You'll hear a few emergency management and disaster preparedness terms mentioned by multiple guests throughout this episode. VAL stands for Voluntary Agency Liaison. A community of practice is a term for a group of people who share a concern or passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly, which groups like Lutheran Disaster Response have adopted. That about covers it. Now here's Regina to get us started.
Hi, my name is Regina Banks, and I'm excited to be rejoined by Christine Moffett, Program Director for Environment and Energy Policy at the ELCA, to discuss FEMA's evolving role and how recent policy changes may impact her work. Under the current Trump administration, FEMA has experienced significant cuts, including the elimination of over 2,000 positions and major reductions to pre-disaster mitigation programs. These include programs like BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, which provides funding for local governments to invest in infrastructure that can withstand climate-related disasters. And other cutbacks have affected hazard mitigation grant programs and local disaster response coordination. Good afternoon, Christine.
Hey, Regina. So happy to be with you again.
Good to be with you again. Can you tell us a little bit about FEMA's mandate and how the ELCA participates within FEMA's mandate?
Yeah, so FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and FEMA is actually placed within the Department of Homeland Security, which, they deal with more broadly security concerns. Most notably, they work on immigration and things with the border. And so it's kind of a unique situation for FEMA to be a part of them, but FEMA is the federal coordinating body that responds to natural disasters as well as man-made disasters. And so oftentimes we see FEMA tents and FEMA folks on the ground after a hurricane or a wildfire, like you saw in California. But there's also examples where the train derailment in Ohio, FEMA responded to that as well. FEMA really, I think their mission is to be a capacity builder, but a coordinating body. And so they host a lot of knowledge on, who to contact, how to get people out to disaster areas, and then how to fund the response effort. I'm sure you'll hear more about Lutheran Disaster Response specifically, but I think in how they relate to FEMA is we've been able to connect with officials within FEMA who are familiar with Lutheran Disaster Response off the top of their head, because they know that these are the implementers of a lot of the programs. These are the partners. They're often referred to as voluntary organizations active in disaster, VOAD, and that we would be considered one of those. The FEMA personnel that I was able to meet with had our training manual that we use to train, members of our Lutheran Disaster Response Network, had it and said, I use this as an example in my office here in DC to talk about what the capacity is beyond just us.
Oh, wow. That's incredible.
Yeah, so we have been referred to from the FEMA administrators a lot of these career civil servants as partners in this work, as well as experts and people that they can solicit input from.
So what does it mean when a partner organization, in this case, FEMA, partnering with us partnering with FEMA, what does it mean when that partner loses 2,000 positions and starts cutting programs that we've partnered in administering and in bringing into fruition?
Because we often say in our office, like, you have the safety net from the federal government, and then you have the safety net under the safety net, and that's
Sure.
us, right? So if FEMA can only do so much because we've fired 2,000 employees and we've, closed a bunch of programs, if the safety net under the safety net is LDR and the work of the church and our people, we're going to be far beyond capacity. Additionally, there is a program that's still really important to us called the VAL program. The VAL program relates to the volunteer organizations, and those staff personnel have really been vital as far as communicating between FEMA and the capacity they can provide with information and data to the people that actually have the resources, right? Like, we have a church that could host emergency responders, but we don't know who is here and who needs a place to go. Okay, well, the VALs can help coordinate that. And the VAL program has definitely seen an impact either in staffing or just in the ability for them to communicate with us as partners. And so, unfortunately, we used to have a very robust relationship. They would attend our conferences or our meetings. And just in the course of the last 6 months, we've had cancellations for multiple conferences or appearances where they were supposed to show up. And so that partnership kind of slowing down has been really concerning, I think, across LDR and other organizations.
I know that you've been spending more time on the Hill and in international spaces trying to tell these stories about partnership and about impact on the ground. What has been the response from either the administration or from Congress?
I think that most lawmakers you talk to can acknowledge the importance of disaster response, the importance of partnership, and the importance of churches, like faith communities, whatever you want to call it. I think when we're talking from the Lutheran context, I think most members we talk to, decision makers can say, yes, you provide very valuable services to the community, whether that's on Sunday or that's beyond Sunday, as a community space, as a hosting space. It's strange that we're seeing, when you can talk to the decision makers, a very tempered, well thought out response, but then the changes that are happening from the top down don't seem to reflect that.
And you're also spending more time in some international spaces with our LWF and international colleagues. How is this being received in international spaces?
The U.S. is definitely pulling back from a lot of the international collaboration efforts that we have previously participated in. But as the faith community, I think our concern for people, but also our direct stake in this as an implementer, as a stakeholder for responding to increased natural disaster, man-made or not, I think we can add a unique voice. What we're seeing in the US, I'm currently in DC with the heat dome that's happening and the heat wave across the East Coast. And so I can speak right now about effects of climate change. But I think as we're seeing increased storms, increased wildfires, more severe hurricanes, we're only seeing a small portion of what those in more vulnerable countries are seeing. And so how can we, if we're even struggling here to coordinate our response, our disaster response, and then also how can we prepare? How can we mitigate disaster? How can we ensure communities are resilient? If the job of FEMA and the job of our, federal disaster response is to do all of those things, and that's kind of breaking down, imagine what some of our partners across the world are dealing with in much more dire situations. And so I think the global context has been telling, but also difficult to grapple with. Have the domestic context in mind, but then also to kind of zoom out and be like, if this is what we're dealing with, that's only a portion of what others are. And how can we do our part?
Yeah, I can tell the way that you're answering the question, that it's a personal struggle for you, and we're grateful for your continued steadfastness in those places. When you do have conversations on the Hill right now, what are you asking for? I think that the 2,000 positions have been eliminated. They're gone. So what we got to talk about? What is there to say?
No, good question. There's a lot of like dim news out there, but this is an area where I feel like we could make some progress. I'll also note that something that you didn't get to touch on was there were a lot of like infusion of climate metrics and climate concerns into the work of FEMA just generally that has all been taken away. There was a program called the Community Disaster Resilience Zones that like reformatted the way that FEMA funded some of their, or like chose some of the funding scheme for how they would grant certain communities by using socioeconomic indicators as well as climate indicators. They were able to delineate certain zones that were most vulnerable to climate and then least resilient towards being able to recover from a disaster. And it was a map. The zones were laid out, and then FEMA had a commitment that they were going to invest in those communities most to lift them up in preparation. And so that program also has been stopped and that data has been removed, which is tricky because so many other organizations rely on that data that FEMA is working on.
I've heard of several teachers who rely on that information in their lessons plans, just teaching about, the water cycle, or like here in Sacramento, the American River and Sacramento River confluence here in the area. And that information no longer exists for just primary and secondary school educators. So the results are widespread.
Yeah, and it's definitely concerning when you're talking about preparing. I mean, that's kind of one of the core tenets of FEMA is like, how can we prepare for this stuff? So if the data is not there, I think communities don't know how to adjust. So with that being said, we had heard earlier in the year, obviously there was an executive order that came out that wanted to review FEMA as a agency. It asked for a review council to be appointed and for them to provide recommendations to the president about how to move forward with FEMA. And then nothing happened. It just sat, and then you just got news about cuts and programs closing, data being taken down. And then there were rumors that the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, was going to just get rid of the agency. And the counter proposal would be that we would just grant fund directly, just block grants to states directly from the White House, which if that money does get there, it's really needed. But the capacity building and the coordination is a huge part about FEMA. A lot of these states don't have the budget or the capacity to do their own statewide coordination, let alone a disaster that hits cross-state boundaries.
Right.
What if there's only a couple counties in one state that are affected? So we put out a big push along with other advocacy groups to answer a request for information from the federal government that was asking for people's experience with FEMA. And we had lots of people commit to providing a comment, and most of which, provided very real feedback on how FEMA could improve. There's a lot of things FEMA could do better, but also the need and the value of FEMA as an agency and for the government to stay on his work. And that following week, we received news that President Trump decided to appoint members to the council to review FEMA. And it was a bipartisan group that was appointed. And they had their first meeting back in May, and nothing concrete came out of it, but you did get to hear where different folks were at. Mainly from when I skimmed the list, it was a lot of representatives from the Gulf South, just as hurricanes are the most expensive disasters that FEMA sees. Just important to note, there might be a little skew on opinions based on the type of disaster. So they were able to kind of provide feedback and things that they would like to see happen to FEMA. And around the same time, we received word that there is a bill coming out of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee in the House that's led by the chair and the ranking member. So it's a bipartisan bill to reform FEMA. But as we were able to review it, I can tell you a little bit about what the proposal includes.
Please.
It would restore FEMA as an independent agency that reports directly to the president. So take it out of DHS and it would become its own thing. Very interesting. It would make it easier for individuals without a fixed address, like individuals experiencing homelessness, for example, to access post-disaster housing assistance. It would lengthen the amount of time FEMA can assist disaster-impacted households. It would also create a unified disaster assistance application for all federal disaster assistance programs. That would be huge. We've been asking for that for a long time. And it would direct FEMA to create clear and understandable notices regarding program eligibility. There's oftentimes been a lot of complaints about why people get rejected and then how they get notified of rejection. And then removes penalties for disaster survivors who utilize crowdfunding sites. Like in the past, people have used like a GoFundMe or something. And those are just like some of the top lines. I'll say when I was reading the bill, it's a very long bill, but when I was reading the draft bill, it even defines what a disaster is, what recovery means in such a holistic way. Like when they define recovery, they say, recover from the disaster to a point to where you can sustain future disasters. Now that is much more
Resiliency.
holistic.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so we're pretty excited about this bill. It's still in its draft form, so there hasn't been an official bill dropped. But the committee staff has been really intentional about reaching out to stakeholders like, VOAD groups like LDR to receive feedback and really have something that could work across the board, across the aisle, across the country for folks as we see increased natural disaster. The whole circle would be building resiliency, because once you recover, you're going to have to go right into prepping, And so we try to bring those components into our meetings with lawmakers and just try to make this a priority.
Christine Moffett, Program Director for Environment and Energy Policy of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Thanks so much for coming out, Christine.
Thanks, Regina.
Up next, Regina speaks to Maren Olson from Lutheran Disaster Response.
This morning, I have the pleasure of speaking with Maren Olson, Director of Lutheran Disaster Response, to discuss LDR's evolving role and how recent policy changes may impact their work in the wake of FEMA and AmeriCorps. Thank you so much for being here with me, Maren.
Glad to be with you and have this conversation, Regina.
So maybe to do just a little bit of table setting, what role have churches historically played in disaster response? Can you tell us a little bit about LDR?
I'd love to. That's one of my favorite questions. Talk about LDR. So Lutheran Disaster Response is the humanitarian and crisis response ministry of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA. Practically speaking, that means that before, during, and after disasters, we walk alongside communities that have been impacted who say, hi, something happened here, or something could happen, and we'd like some help thinking about that, or planning for, preparing, or responding to a disaster that has happened. So we work by invitation alongside communities, congregations, synods, tribal organizations and indigenous leadership, community-based organizations, and internationally we work with our companion churches and ecumenical partners as well. So we are international, and our commitment as LDR is that we will walk with you as long as you will have us by your side until people are home. So that's our commitment. We're not first responders. We don't parachute in and show up and say, we know what to do. That's not how we operate. It's all in relationship. We're connected. We listen. A lot of encouragement and dreaming with communities to think about what could life look like. The goal is always that life is better after communities have been through a terrible experience, but that life could be even better than it is before the disaster happens. So that's what we do.
How large is the LDR community of practice?
Our community of practice has about 60 people, and that's within the domestic sphere, so across the ELCA footprint.
Okay.
These are disaster professionals who do this work on a regular basis. Most of them are paid positions in a community organization, a social ministry group, or on a synod staff. There are a few that are amazing volunteers who do this work remarkably, consistently, wonderfully over time. And so we work with and alongside them, but bring that community together to be connected to one another for shared learning, because sometimes you need someone who understands the acronyms to talk through a disaster experience.
Oh, the alphabet soup.
Yeah, but it's a cool community amazing people who are deeply passionate and committed to their communities and really care and want life to be good.
How does the federal government regard LDR? And I'm talking about through FEMA, through AmeriCorps, through all of the avenues with which LDR interacts.
So Lutheran Disaster Response is a member of the National VOED, which is Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. There's about 80 organizations across the U.S. who all agree to a code of conduct to say that we serve communities first. It's not about, we will not proselytize, we don't recruit. It's about caring for communities and meeting where they are, and that we work in collaboration within the National VOED community within the movement. Each organization has sort of their own niche, their own area of expertise. And National VOED members and FEMA work very closely together in places where there is a federal declaration. In places where there isn't a declaration, it's us. We're the ones that show up, because emergency management has a very important but very narrowly focused role in a disaster. I sometimes say a little bluntly, but it helps people understand, when the power's back on, the roads are open, and the bodies have been picked up, emergency management is really done. They're on to the next thing. But that doesn't deal with, my basement has 6 feet of water in it, or I don't have a house anymore. So it's the voluntary organizations like Lutheran Disaster Response and our partners who will walk with individual households through the response and the recovery process toward that individual family's recovery plan. What does it look like, or what do they want life to look like at the end of the day? So we're really integral. FEMA very closely works with National VOED organizations. And actually last fall, we had a FEMA VAL, a voluntary agency liaison, who spoke to our community of practice and teared up, talking about how much he loves the work that we do and deeply respects and appreciates the work we do. And it was really fun to hear him say, one of the things I send out all the time is LDR's Congregational Preparedness Guide. He shares it. I was like, this is great. This is a document that we have. It's a resource, like a workbook for congregations to go through. And this guy who works for FEMA, who has all of those resources, chooses ours because he finds it really helpful. That was awesome to hear.
You just mentioned that every organization kind of has their own niche. What is LDR's niche?
We do long-term recovery, disaster case management, which is that working with individual families, and emotional and spiritual care.
Moving from what feels good to what feels a little less good. How have recent federal policy changes, and I'm talking particularly about FEMA and AmeriCorps, how have those policy shifts affected the ability of organizations like LDR and other faith-based organizations to serve their neighbors in crisis?
It's been tough. I'll be honest, it's been really hard. A very practical example is that AmeriCorps teams their terms were canceled. We had teams in Pennsylvania, we had teams in Puerto Rico working with some of our community of practice partners with LDR grantees, and they got a notice one day that they were going to be done the next. They were in the middle of mucking out houses after flooding in Pennsylvania, helping with rebuilding, literally hammers and nails and screws and sheetrock. And in Puerto Rico, working with our partner on repairing roofs and houses, that some of which are still damaged from Hurricane Maria 8 years ago. Incredibly committed volunteer team that signed up to do this work for a year with this partner and got notified, you're done. What does that do to those individuals who are not making a lot of money? They're on a stipend. Right. But also, what does it say about that disaster survivor? What does it tell them about their value? Do they matter? When those volunteers are suddenly ripped away from the community, it's incredibly devastating all the way around, because there wasn't a plan. The plan was for those teams to do that work. And so our partners have scrambled to say thank you to the volunteers quickly before they left town, but also to say, okay, now how do we do this? How do we finish this project where we thought we had the labor covered? Labor is one of the biggest costs in disaster recovery. And we want people to be paid a living wage. That's not a question. But when there can be volunteer labor or it's an in-kind contribution, it helps dollars go further. So that's one very clear place where we've seen a direct impact. AmeriCorps was named and celebrated as the Partner of the Year for National VOED this year. And there was no one at the conference who was allowed to come to receive the plaque.
So in that example that you just mentioned in Pennsylvania, what did happen the next day? What happened in those houses with the sheetrock and the screws?
Because we have amazing partners, they got on the phone, they got on email and reached out to their local partners and said, help. Do you have anyone who can come so that they could finish out those projects? And it worked. It took longer than planned. It was definitely a serious juggle. And there's a lot less houses that will have roofs completed in Puerto Rico because of the team being pulled out as well.
I want to ask you what I think is probably an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. When the federal government becomes an unreliable partner in the necessary work that we had been doing together, how should churches discern their role when those systems fail or are intentionally weakened? What is our responsibility as Christians, and understanding that we cannot do it all? We cannot pick up a whole federal government that has become unreliable. How do you triage what is due?
It's a good question. Thank you for asking it. The gift that FEMA has been as a partner is that in reality, most disasters that happen in the United States are not federally declared. They never get a federal declaration. We have a simulation game and you roll a die to see if there's a declaration. If there's a 1, there's a declaration. If it's a 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, there's not a declaration. And that's a pretty good percentage, actually, if you average it out in terms of the disasters that happen versus what gets a federal declaration. So the nonprofit organizations are already doing a huge amount of work, doing the vast majority of disaster response and recovery alongside local emergency management, primarily faith-based and other nonprofit organizations that aren't faith-affiliated who are doing disaster response. What FEMA brings, the gift that they bring, is bringing in federal dollars when there is a declaration, so that individual assistance means that a household can register with FEMA and potentially get up to $42,500 toward replacing their home and their belongings. That's $42,500 that LDR or our partners don't have to find, right? It helps the dollars that we have go further. So when FEMA's not as reliable, when FEMA doesn't show up, or I live in St. Louis, Missouri, it took almost a month after a devastating tornado here to get a federal declaration. And I could have told you the same day it will qualify. Not because I have a magic crystal ball, but because I can look and see very clearly the impact on my community and know that when 5,000 homes and structures are damaged, it's going to rise to the level of qualifying for a federal declaration. What that delay meant is local organizations had to stand up and figure out, we're going to shelter, we're going to feed, we're going to find short-term to medium-term housing for folks, we're going to do clothing, where do pets go? All of the pieces none of those resources that the federal government can bring to bear were available. It already stretched nonprofits. That's the bottom line.
How can churches and synods better prepare themselves to be effective responders in local disasters, whether natural or human-made? Here in California, I'm thinking about civil unrest in Los Angeles and other non-fire related disasters that also do affect communities. So how can congregations and synods be better partners?
The first step is to acknowledge that disasters happen. We would love to all pretend that it's not going to happen to us. A study that FEMA did recently is that people hear the term preparedness, but right around 50% of American households feel they're prepared for disaster. One of the best things a congregation can do is to be intentional to say, what is our disaster preparedness plan? Where are the record books? If they're stored in the basement, maybe you should think about bringing them upstairs. Who has keys to the church? Is there a plan that if a fire happens, like in LA, if a wildfire happens, whose job is it to go to the church and get the records? right? I mean, practical things like that. Who can go turn off the power? What is our plan if something happens in our community? Could we serve as a shelter? Are we registered with the Red Cross to let them know that we're willing to do that and we can be part of the official system? So to talk about your church's plan, and we do have a congregational preparedness guide that's available for download for free from the ELCA resource store, but also then for households. What is your household's preparedness plan? What's your strategy? Do you have a go bag? Do you have copies of important papers, like notarized copies, or do you have your passports and your marriage certificate and birth certificates and social security cards and a copy of your household insurance policy? All of those things. Do you have them in a waterproof pouch where you can grab it and go if you had to leave in 5 minutes?
No.
Okay. And it's not a test, Regina. But
Because I'm failing
your
over here.
honesty. One of the other things that we've put together, because it can feel really overwhelming, right? It's a lot when you start thinking about it. And paralysis is often what comes because it comes out of fear, right? So we have a Prepare in 12 Months, a curriculum that, again, available for free, and you can modify it. Our wonderful partners in the Oregon Synod put it together, and you could do it. It could be a Bible study at your congregation. It could be a small group project to say, this month we're going to do X. And then next month we're going to focus on this piece of preparedness. It also spreads out expenses. So thinking about how can you be prepared as an individual, and then talk to your neighbor. Talk to your congregation. Those are very practical, real, helpful ways that congregations and synods can engage, lifting that up and saying, what are the hazards that happen where I live? And how can I be prepared? Because it's going to look different in Oregon or California or St. Louis or Florida. We all have different hazards.
This is an advocacy podcast. So from your perspective, how might the church and then churches and synods advocate for more just and equitable federal disaster policy? Is it too late for FEMA? Is it too late for AmeriCorps? Especially in under-resourced communities?
I hope not. I hope and pray not. To call your members of Congress and say, this is important, especially in communities who have been through a disaster, to say, I am a disaster survivor, and FEMA was an important part of my recovery. To share those stories, to lift those up. To be honest, when it was really hard. It's not a perfect system, but wow, is it helpful to have those federal partners and have the voluntary agency liaisons who work so closely with LDR and our partners. I mean, they are on speed dial and vice versa. I mean, we connect with them on a regular basis. So to lift up personal experiences, but also to advocate for communities that without those dollars, recovery simply won't happen. There's a lot of mistrust in some of our historically marginalized communities. I saw that in Selma, Alabama, after the tornado went through there, an incredibly divided community historically and today. And there were a lot of rumors. There was a lot of misinformation. People thought that if they registered with FEMA would come and take your house. And so a significant portion of the Black community would not sign up with FEMA. With the Southeastern Synod, our partner there, they hired an outreach coordinator. And Sharonda was an absolute gift in that community because she's from Selma. She's born and raised there. She knows the community. She knew where to go and knock on doors and say, hey, this is who I am. Can we talk?
Yeah.
What do you need? What's going on here? And then she could go to the long-term recovery committee and say, you can't just help people that registered with FEMA, because here's a list of 80 families that I just talked to in the last 2 weeks who need your help too. So she could advocate at that level to leverage dollars. And they changed their policy to hear cases for people who hadn't registered with FEMA because of her work. That's what the church can do, to show up and walk alongside individuals impacted by disaster in their own community, as well as advocate on a national level. Does FEMA need some reforming? Absolutely. But burning it all down and trying to build something from scratch is not the best way. I really don't believe. It is not going to make life better for now and in the years to come. We need to work carefully, strategically, collaboratively with FEMA and federal agencies alongside the nonprofits and community-based organizations that do disaster response and recovery to build a more equitable system together.
Maren Olson, Director of Lutheran Disaster Response, thank you so much for the ministry that you do and for being with us here this morning.
You are most welcome. Thanks for the opportunity to share.
Now we'll hear from Jamie Benneker about the local impact of Lutheran Disaster Response.
Hey everybody, my name is Jamie Benneker. I am the Disaster Response Coordinator for the Indiana-Kentucky Synod of the ELCA. So first of all, my position is funded through Lutheran Disaster Response. They brought me into this position a little over a year ago, and it really began in response to the tornado that came through in 2021 through Graves County, through Mayfield, Kentucky, and surrounding areas, and the damage that caused. And then the subsequent flooding that happened in 2021 and 22 as well. And just in the interests of, trying to help those communities heal. It was really sort of a grassroots effort led by pastors such as, Colleen Winkler and others who, had congregations, members of congregations who were affected by those disasters and wanting to, do what they could do to help that community become as whole as they could again. And so with the help of Lutheran Disaster Response, we funded several long-term recovery projects in both of those disasters where we were able to come in and help families with construction materials to rebuild homes, maybe to help pay for labor. There was some funding that was opened up for Colleen and her team to help host Camp Noah. Camp Noah is it's a nationally accredited program, and they'll come down and they'll do camps in different communities. And their program is sort of around helping children feel safe again. So they have a proven resiliency curriculum. It includes all types of different activities and play. The kids leave camp with what we would call a go bag. A go bag would be a sort of a backpack that's going to have items in it that they might need, right? That they can grab quickly if they have to go to shelter really fast, just to try to help them, feel like if this happens to them again, that they have a plan, and that they are safe. I always tell the story about how my first week, my bio came out, that I was the Synod Disaster Response Coordinator. It came out in the e-news at probably 2:00 in the afternoon. And then by 4:00, we had a tornado hit, near Madison, Indiana, and Jeffersonville, Kentucky. And then later that night, Winchester got hit with an F3 tornado. So it's just kind of been one of those things, one after the other. And I think we are all very thankful, to be able to engage in this ministry. Kentucky this year has had 3 major disasters back to back to back. They had 200-year floods, and then they had the F4 tornado that went through Somerset and London, Kentucky. And it really is amazing to see all of the different organizations, disaster organizations, and how they work together, both in the immediate response, but then also as we move into long-term recovery. There's a disaster service for just about anything you could think of. Pets that need care for, if you need Wi-Fi, if you need a shower trailer, if you need meals. It's just amazing to see how the groups come together to support those communities in those events. Lutheran Disaster Response, they're just amazing. Ever since day one, I remember the first disaster that same day I was telling you about. I think Maren and Sean and Zaya all called me within about 30 minutes of each other to say, hey, we see that this is going on. We're here to help you in whatever way we can. So they're there in the immediate sense. And then they're there to help us fund long-term recovery. And then they're there to help us with our congregations to help us develop our preparedness on several projects we're working on in the Synod, from a crisis to community game that we've been playing with our congregations that puts people through a disaster as a survivor of a disaster and what that is going to look like, kind of step by step. We have another partnership we've developed through Disciples of Joy and other partners where we do a workshop called Disasterville, where we put congregations or leaders through a game or through a scenario where they have walked out of their home. A disaster has just happened in their neighborhood, and now they're going to walk out their front door. What do I do next? And all the way down to a new project that Christine's helping me pilot, which is an asset mapping project where we're working with congregations to figure out what are some of the things that their congregation, what skills might they have, or what physical assets might they have that could be useful to their communities in the event of a disaster. And so for us, it's been about trying to build resiliency by building up that local capacity, I guess, right? It's actually probably more likely they help in a neighboring community, right? If it's one thing that I have learned in the year and a half or so that I've been doing this, it's that a little bit of preparedness goes a long way. And it's hard to have conversations after the disaster's happened or in the midst of the disaster, right? But if you have sat down, if our congregations and our individuals and our synod have sat down and talked about things and kind of laid out some ideas ahead of time, we're building this groundwork, we're building these partnerships, it's good work, it's good ministry work. Building partnerships between our synod and other disaster response organizations that do things that maybe we don't do. But how can we connect to other organizations without completely reinventing the wheel? And how can we support each other in that? The VOAD has, sort of these group calls, and you sit on these group calls and you listen to county officials and you sort of figure out what are the needs in that community, right? Because you don't want to send in things that they don't need. So you want to listen. And that's a really big part of the ministry. It's just listening. We had a congregation in Somerset, Kentucky, in this most recent tornado that went through London and Somerset. And we had a congregation, Redeemer Lutheran Church, who took a direct hit from the tornado. Their fellowship hall is fairly well gone. A part of their building is still standing, but we're going to be there to walk with them, through this long-term recovery process to restore their space. But what was so kind of neat about where the ministry has come in the last year and a half, when we heard about it initially, we were able to connect their congregation with other organizations that respond immediately in disaster, right? Our niche is more long-term recovery, but they needed somebody to come in and clean up debris. So we were able to connect them with an organization called Masters of Disaster. But so then Darren and his crew were able to go down there and, a day or two after the tornado, they cleaned out did all their debris cleanup, found their baby grand piano, across from their fellowship hall. They were able to restore, pull that out and get that into a safe place, so that wouldn't be damaged any further. They had things that they needed, so we were able to connect them with resources that we had on the ground there to be able to say, hey, this is where you need to go get trash bags, or this is where you need to go get tarps, this is where you need to go get totes, and to be able to directly guide them where they needed to go. And then they had some carpet that they needed pulled up here, a few days after, because that's one thing. It's hard to think about this, but that disaster happens and it takes time to get to all these things, right? And so we had a Methodist group who came in and tore up all their carpet, and they were able to haul all of that away. I mean, just tree debris cleanup and all those things, so labor intensive, but we were able to effectively and pretty quickly get people there with their congregation on the ground to help them get moving in the right direction as quickly as possible. And I think that's really the goal. That's resiliency. I think how we can lean on each other in those times in our local communities and our local people to get in there where folks need it and get them on their way. I think that helps, in their healing process and in their recovery.
Finally, let's hear from both Christine and Maren about where they have seen the gospel recently in their work.
All right. Christine, where have you seen the gospel recently in your work?
I think I got the chance to answer this last time I was on, and I'd like to say that it's very similar in times where it feels like so much is changing and stuff is scary. I think the people that are willing to speak up, and maybe this will be slightly different, the people who maybe it's not in their best interest to take a bold stance, that take that bold stance. I think we're seeing lawmakers right now specifically that, it's not always safe and comfy to disagree with your party, but they're standing up for their values, for the values of their constituents. And any chance I get to see an example of that, I think that shows me the gospel, that brings me hope in this work.
Maren, where have you seen the gospel recently in your work?
Goodness, I was just at the U.S.-Mexico border because the Amparo Ministry, the Migrant Accompaniment Ministry, is one of the things that LDR supports. And we visited a shelter for migrants. So just across the border in Mexico, people from all over Central America. They've had actually people from countries in Asia and Africa, as well as Central and South America. But to see the care of the staff there for the residents, but that they are not clients, they're not customers. It is a community. And so the person in charge of the tortilla making has the keys for that because that's his responsibility. The staff doesn't hold the keys because there's a very different understanding about how do we come together and be community, that everyone has a role to play. And that was truly seeing the gospel, seeing lifting up the least of these. The other place, just an email that arrived yesterday from a partner in California in response to the wildfires, food insecurity is exacerbated. And so we're going to do a couple of grants for specific feeding programs, and how necessary that assistance is. The partner said we needed this phone call because people couldn't even figure out how to afford a few dollars for a meal. We were scrambling, trying to find that money. And so this is what gifts to LDR do, is that it feeds people so they can make a plan for tomorrow, because it's pretty hard to think about your future when you're hungry today. It's caring for people who have fled desperate, awful situations in their countries of origin and are looking for a better place so that they can have a safe place to stay and be seen as the full human child of God that they are. And that can be honored and celebrated, and they have time and space to make a plan about next steps.
Thank you to Christine, Marin, and Jamie for their contributions to this episode. You can learn more about Lutheran Disaster Response's work by going to elca.org/LDR. From that page, you can sign up for alerts, learn about their domestic and international work, as well as donate to active relief efforts, such as those occurring in Texas. You can also find a link to the disaster preparedness guide mentioned by Christine and Marin in the show notes. Finally, the ELCA Action Center has an active alert in support of robust federal disaster relief. The direct URL can be found in the show notes, and all of our active alerts can be found at elca.org/advocacy/action center. This concludes this episode of Here I Pod. If you want to contact us, you can email us over at elcaadvocacypodcast@elca.org or leave us a voicemail at 866-740-3522. Thank you for listening.